In September 2022, the body of 49-year-old Christine Davis was found nearly decayed at her home in Georgia. The scene was an eyesore, and everyone in her undisclosed neighborhood was left shattered and confused by her death because nothing like that had ever occurred there before. It was evident that someone close to her meticulously planned her demise and paid attention to all the details that would make her death seem mysterious. At first, it looked like not even the police could figure out what led to Christine's death, but eventually Christine's case developed to be one of the most complicated homicides in Georgia. It was not just her death that shocked everyone. It was the killer who happened to be Christine's own daughter. Christine had an obsessed daughter that came back to ruin her life all of a sudden, and no one even knew she had a daughter. The complicated case was brought to life on September 10, 2022, when a middle-aged man living in Alston, Georgia called the attention of some of his neighbors so he could speak to them about a recurring odor that had been disturbing the neighborhood. The middle-aged man called Joe, who was also Christine's closest neighbor, noticed that the air wasn't as fresh as it used to be around his house in particular. Joe was tired of scrunching his nose each time he went to his backyard or tried to get fresh air in his porch. He tried his best to ignore the discomfort for as long as he could until it felt like the odor was getting worse each day. The other neighbors recalled that Joe called for a meeting through the neighborhood group chat just so he could talk to them about the sudden discomfort he had to endure. Some of the neighbors present at the meeting told Joe he was not alone because they had also noticed that there was an odd smell circulating. It was a mystery for the neighbors, and they needed to get the answers. Aside from the odor problem, Joe also noticed that Christine was noticeably absent from the meeting. He expected her to be one of the first people to show up since their houses were the closest to each other, so he thought they had it worse when it came to the strange odor. Christine's absence from the meeting raised eyebrows, so the neighbors decided to go to her house since it was important for them to figure out what the next step would be together. No one had seen Christine for nearly 2 weeks, but they didn't think much of it, because Christine had suddenly announced on the group chat that she had retired from work months back, and she even invited the neighbors for her retirement party. Ever since Christine retired, she would hardly be seen outside, and when the neighbors asked, she would just say she was finally enjoying herself after years of working. Her sudden retirement was not expected because she was not that old, but Christine fooled everyone into believing that all was well, when in reality, her world was crumbling down, and she was forced to lose her freedom. The neighbors decided to check up on Christine that day, but even after knocking severely, there was no response from her. Everyone also noticed something extremely weird the moment they got closer to Christine's front door. The smell got worse. It was disgusting and unusual, and Joe could not help but get suspicious, so he asked the other neighbors to search the house together with him just so they could find out if there was anything wrong. The search ended up to be one of the most traumatic experiences for everyone involved. Tracy, one of the neighbors, was the one who decided to get closer to the garage during the search. What Tracy would later discover would leave all of them speechless. After everyone forced their way into the garage, the stench in there became worse, and it became evident that the strange odor that had discomforted the neighborhood for days was actually coming from Christine Davis's compound. They were all shocked, and instead of being curious, the neighbors were traumatized by the thought of what they might end up finding in the garage. It was supposed to be a long search because nobody had an idea of what they were expected to find during the search. Joe suspected that it would just be a rat infestation, after which the rats suddenly died, and that's what was causing the bad stench. That was not the case, though, because after some time, the neighbors realized that there was a body in Christine's car. Yes, there was an actual body in Christine's car, and the sight of it traumatized everyone present. They couldn't identify who it was, or if it was even a body, and the fact that the car was locked made matters worse. The neighbors realized that there was nothing they could do at that moment because they had played their part, and it was time for the right authorities to take over from them. When the blaring sirens of police officers took over the silence in the neighborhood, everyone realized that the once quiet neighborhood was never going to be the same again if it was actually a body that was decaying in Christine's car. They were all suspects, and it could be one of them responsible for her demise. It was no longer a common stench that troubled the neighbors. It was the possibility that they could be walking around with Christine's killer, and they didn't even have an idea of who it was. When the police officers arrived, they got to work almost immediately and started to examine the garage. The medical examiner knew it was a body immediately he set eyes on it, but the body had started to decay, so it was difficult to identify who it actually was. The car was locked, but after the officers got in, they met the most traumatizing sight ever. There was a body decaying on the leather seats at the back, and the car didn't show any signs of struggle at all. But there was a body there, which meant that whoever the killer was intentionally dumped the body there. The investigation started almost immediately, and all the neighbors were called to separate rooms to get interviewed. One of the officers suspected that there was foul play because Christine had not been reported missing by her neighbors for over 2 weeks. But the neighbors tried to convince the officers that the only reason they didn't report her missing was because that wasn't the first time she had pulled a stunt like that. The case had already started off weird and suspicious, and barely hours later, the officers realized that Christine's house might actually be the crime scene. But the problem was that everywhere looked untouched, and it didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary happened. There were no bloodstains, scratches, or even damaged property. Not even the car seemed like it had gone through any form of hard activity. It seemed like the killer was very good at hiding her tracks, and the officers had a difficult time understanding what was going on. After proper examination, the medical examiner identified the body, and it was actually Christine Davis's body. It was now murder case, one that would reveal more secrets than anyone could have imagined. Even after several hours of interviewing the neighbors, the officers didn't get anywhere in Christine's case. It felt like there was a loophole somewhere, but they just couldn't figure out where. Since it became difficult to determine what was going on, the officers decided to dig a little deeper into Christine's life. They wanted to find out if she had any family they could call, not just so they could break the news about her death, but also because they wanted to find out why Christine Davis suddenly retired at just 49 years old. Finding Christine's family took a lot of time, and it was almost like she didn't really have any living family. But while the officers kept on searching, they came across something that was very suspicious. Christine's distant cousin revealed that Christine had a daughter before, but she had put her daughter up for adoption when she was just 8 years old. That revelation wasn't supposed to have been relevant to the case, but something more unusual was discovered. Christine's daughter suddenly showed up 8 months before her death, and they started living together. Yes, the estranged mother and daughter actually started living together. The neighbors stated that they had no idea that Christine had a daughter, or that she even lived with someone at her home. But Christine's distant cousin, who was quite close to her, was able to show the officers their private chats where Christine told her that her daughter suddenly showed up. There was something fishy, and it felt like everyone could smell it. Christine's daughter showing up was not the problem. What surprised the officers was the fact that no one except Christine's distant cousin, who lived far away, had an idea that Christine started living with someone. The officers had to dig into Jade Simpson, Christine's daughter, who had been adopted by another family years back. Something was just not right, but by each day, the case seemed like it took a brutal turn. An example would be when the officers visited Jade Simpson's adopted family, so they could get to know Jade's whereabouts. Her adopted parents claimed that Jade had not been seen by them in months, and that she had cut off all ties with them the moment she turned 18 years old. They claimed that they only saw her when she needed money from them. When asked about Jade's behavior, her adopted parents just said she was a strange child who was always hard to understand. Kayla, Jade's adopted mother, stressed that Jade barely showed any emotions throughout the 8 years they spent together as a family. Kayla felt like Jade just chose to shut herself up from them because she didn't want to get close to them. But Matthew, Jade's adopted father, had other things to say. He claimed that Jade was not just complicated but also possessed, and that he was glad she no longer wanted to stay close to him and Kayla. The officers found Matthew's description of Jade strange, so they tried to pull him to the side to hear more from him, but Kayla stopped them immediately. She laughed awkwardly and claimed that her husband was just trying to be witty, so they should ignore his words. When the officers left the Simpson house, they knew that there was just something that wasn't adding up. Kayla had refused to let them into Jade's room, even after they stressed that it was important for the investigation. Kayla claimed that she renovated the room and nothing that belonged to Jade was there anymore. Even when the officers tried to just get a look, Kayla got angry and told them they could only check when they had a search warrant, otherwise they had to leave the house. The head of the investigation suspected foul play the moment they left the Simpson house. She found it weird that Kayla, who was warm and welcoming at first, suddenly turned cold the moment Matthew tried to give them a clearer view on Jade's character. If the case had gotten spooky just then, it got worse the next day when the officers met with some of Jade's college mates. You might wonder why they couldn't just meet with Jade herself. Well, that's because Jade had suddenly disappeared and no one could reach her. It was like she had covered her tracks intentionally just so she could hide so well that no one would catch her. It seemed intentional and calculated, and that's just what made the investigation team enraged. You see, Jade thought she was wise enough to cover her tracks, but the more it became hard to find her, the more the officers couldn't wait to find her. She was implicating herself even without her knowledge, and ghosting everyone wasn't helping either. Detective Charles, one of the detectives involved in the case, got so dedicated to finding Jade that he made sure he left no stone unturned. After speaking to someone of Jade's college mates, it became clear that Jade could not possibly be just a normal human being. No one had very nice things to say about her, not because she was mean to them, but because she was just weird and acted in a very disturbing way. Jade was someone who was obsessed with true crime stories and anything that involved violence. Some of her college mates who worked with her on group projects shared that Jade was often too controlling when they had projects together, and she liked to take the lead even though that meant she would make the group fall apart. One of her closest friends who she ended up falling apart with said Jade became weirder each day, and that she was the one that suddenly ended their friendship. The interviews with the college mates were revealing things about Jade, but none of them actually gave Charles the level of insight he needed. He felt like Jade had somehow planned to keep them running around in circles because even though they were learning things about her, they weren't able to learn things that were useful to the murder case and that made every information irrelevant. Charles wanted to know why Jade disappeared and why her adopted mother was eager to dismiss them each time they paid a visit. Charles didn't want to back down, even though that meant laying low for some days and acting like they ditched the case. He set a trap intentionally because he knew that the killer always returned to the crime scene, and Charles was shown that Christine's case would not be an exception. The officers didn't show up to Alston for a few days, and they spent most of their time trying to find out where Jade Simpson had run off to. As a result of the change, Christine's case didn't have any new updates, but that was until the 1st of October 2022, when the officers suddenly got a call that informed them that a young lady had been seen around Christine's house. The officers didn't waste any time, and they ran to the scene to find out who decided to snoop around the scene. Surprisingly, the guest was Jade, the person Charles had been waiting to see all this while. The neighbors didn't recognize her because they had never met her, but the officers recognized Jade thanks to the pictures they got from the Simpson house. Jade looked like she couldn't believe what had happened, and she knew she messed up. The officers didn't waste time, and they started to interview her immediately. But even though it felt like they were finally getting a lead in the case, Jade was strong-headed, and she refused to give the officers what they really wanted. She refused to speak. That was not just strange, but frustrating because she was the only one that could really make everyone understand what was going on. Charles wasn't ready to wait on her and have her sabotage the case, so he decided to take things to the next step. He interrogated her and asked her why she had made a comeback in her mother's life, then suddenly disappeared. Jade claimed that she had no idea about what she was being asked and that she didn't understand any of it. The officers decided to switch things up and simply ask her why she came to Christine's house that day, and she simply said she lived there and only came back home to see her mother. Yes, Jade claimed that she had no idea that her biological mother was dead. She claimed that she was only hearing the news that day. The officers didn't buy her story, and they made that very clear. Christine's body was almost fully decayed when it was found, so even when an autopsy was conducted, the information they were able to get was very limited. Not even a fingerprint identification was able to be found, but the autopsy showed that Christine's cause of death was food poisoning, strangling, and then stabbing. Whoever killed Christine was smart enough to try and hide their tracks so well that they couldn't get caught. But for the officers, it was only a matter of time till the killer was sent to jail. There was no doubt about that, but the question was, who is the killer and why did they kill Christine Davis? It seemed like nothing was working in their favor and the truth would be hidden. But that was until Jade Simpson made the biggest mistake of her life. She panicked and confessed. Oh, you didn't expect that part, right? Now here's what happened. Jade thought she was actually going to keep the truth from the officers forever. But that was until the officers finally got a search warrant for the room she owned in the Simpson house. Kayla Simpson was spooked the moment she realized that Jade's room was going to be searched. She actually tried to stop the officers from going into the room until Matthew was able to pull her to the side in order to stop her from obstructing the officers. Jade's room looked normal at first until the officers were able to get into her safes. Yes, she had safes in her room. The safes were filled with pictures of Christine, and they all had a part of her body missing in the pictures. Jade had a full-on picture, description, and outline about Christine's life, job, and even her house. Her safe looked like a weird ritual spot, and the officers found more disturbing things than they decided to disclose. Even though they learnt more than they were supposed to, one thing they couldn't deny was the fact that Jade Simpson was obsessed with her biological mother, and it was a very bad obsession. When the officers gathered evidence of her obsession, they told Jade she was already a suspect in her mother's case and that she could either confess or face the wrath when the truth finally started to unveil itself. Jade got scared because she actually thought the officers had found out a lot more, even though they were only playing mind games with her. She had a sudden outburst where she stated that her biological mother was a witch who ruined her life at only 8 years old. Jade claimed that Christine never treated her like a daughter, and that's why she put her up for adoption, even though she begged her not to do it. Jade confessed that she never forgave Christine for what she did to her, and that's why she spent years of her life stalking her biological mother and looking for ways to see her suffer. Jade confessed that she always held a grudge against Christine and couldn't understand why she lived her life without ever looking for her. Jade said she hated the fact that Christine had a job and even a house and car. She felt like Christine didn't deserve to be happy, and that's why she took it upon herself to give her biological mother karma, since she felt like the universe was taking too long to do that. When asked how she was able to ruin Christine's life, Jade finally started confessing to a lot of disgusting things. Jade barged into Christine's house months before she killed her and held her at gunpoint. After that, she forced a terrified Christine to write a letter requesting to retire. Jade threatened to kill her the moment she dared raise an alarm or try to set her up. Christine was scared for her life, so she listened to Jade and did all she was asked to do. Jade was merciless, and she went as far as holding Christine hostage in her own home. It was very bad, and the officers eventually discovered that the only reason Christine was hardly seen by her neighbors was all because Jade was controlling her movements. The details of Christine's torture were horrific and incredibly disturbing because it was widely unheard of that a daughter took her own mother hostage and exempted her from the world. Jade forced Christine to live a secluded life because that was her own way of making her mother pay for what she put her through. Another turn in Christine Davis's case was the discovery of Jade's torment to her adopted parents. The Simpsons were terrified of Jade because of how threatening and violent she was when they lived under the same roof. That's why Kayla Simpson didn't want Matthew Simpson to speak on or about Jade, because she was scared of what Jade might get up to if she found out her adopted parents were snitching. After the Simpsons were assured that Jade was already arrested, Kayla confessed that Jade had warned her never to let anyone search her room, otherwise she would make their lives a living hell. Kayla's confession finally made sense because the officers had been aware that something was just not right. Jade claimed that she never planned on killing Christine, but she was forced to because she caught Christine trying to escape and called the cops on her, so forced a poisoned drink down her throat. And when Christine was unconscious, she drove her to the woods and tried to strangle her. Christine got conscious again and tried to fight back, and that's when Jade stabbed her to death. She didn't want to dump her body at the crime scene because it would be easier for her to get caught, so she dumped her body back in the car and drove her back to her house. When asked about how she was able to clean up everything and hide her fingerprints, Jade confessed that she had watched true crime documentaries so much that she cleaned everything up herself. It was evident that Jade was psychotic and she premeditated the crime, but she tried to make it seem like it was unplanned. Charles thought otherwise, and he believed that Christine Davis's murder was something Jade Simpson had been planning for years. She consciously made the decision to kill her mother, and she only waited for the right time to do it. The almost perfect cleanup of the crime scene was another proof that the homicide was intended. After Jade Simpson's arrest, everything finally made sense to everybody. Christine Davis's neighbors finally understood why Christine suddenly retired and stopped socializing altogether. She tried to comply with Jade just so she could save her life, but unfortunately she still lost her life. Her own daughter had been obsessed with her and her life for years, and when she acted on that obsession, Christine couldn't survive it at all. Jade couldn't believe that she had been caught because at some point she actually believed that she was going to get away with the crime. She had planned it for years after all, so she thought she was going to get the happy ending she had spent years of her life dreaming about, a world where her biological mother suffered till her last breath. But that didn't happen for Jade, and she ended up facing the consequences of her actions, even though it was hard for her to believe what was going on. Jade Simpson's trial began months later, and after proper investigation, Jade was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole.